Every family I know has lost somebody to overdose. In the U.S., we've had this 50-year so-called war on drugs, which has just been a brainwashing project to blame the victims, to sort of characterize the disease of addiction as a failure of virtue, a failure of willpower or something, which is, we don't talk about cancer that way. We don't treat other diseases like that.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is one of the United States' foremost writers, novelists, poets, journalists. Barbara Kingsolver has just won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction for her latest work, Demon Copperhead, and the paperback is just being released. The book's already a huge success in hardback. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, we talk to a lot of people on this program about ways to change the world, and you are a writer who perhaps not writing to change the world. You certainly write to reveal it.
That's a good way to put it. Thank you. Because I think that revealing and sort of opening pieces of the world to other people's eyes and hearts is certainly a way to change the world. I think that what's magical about fiction is that it, unlike journalism, which, is also wonderful, it's good to get people information, but in a novel, you put your own life aside and you go into the life of someone else. So you actually experience another life, and I think you come away changed. And in that way, I think all fiction is political. I think writing fiction, inviting people into other lives and sort of removing that otherness is a political act. So I don't know that, I don't really think of it as activism. Activism is something else that I do, go to a school board meeting or write a letter to the editor. But by using the craft of fiction and I guess applying the craft of fiction, I feel that we start with hearts, changing hearts, right?
Yeah, and this book tackles a topic that has been really picked over by different media, which is America's opioid crisis.
Yeah.
So what do you think what did you feel you could do with it that hadn't been explored in journalism and documentary and television series on, streaming platforms and everything else?
That's a good question. And I had a very clear answer in my head from the beginning. I live in southwestern Virginia, in really the epicenter of the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma looked at the metrics, they looked at data, and they selected a handful of places in the United States where basically the population was vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. They chose us because of structural poverty, because of a very thinly stretched healthcare system, for all kinds of reasons. They knew they could pump their OxyContin in there and make a fortune. So that was done to us. I live there. I live with the consequences of this, especially for children. We have a generation of kids growing up without parents because a huge proportion of our kids are being raised by someone other than their parents because their parents are incarcerated or addicted or dead. So it's the foster care system. It's a grandmother. It's someone who might not prefer to be raising them. That's the story I wanted to tell. I think that I really admire journalists like Beth Macy and others who really tracked down the big story of the big players. The DEA, the pharmaceutical companies, the lawsuits. But I was afraid that there's this idea that now that the lawsuits have played out and the judgments have been made, that justice has been done. It hasn't. These kids have to live that. We all in my community have to live with this forever. So the stories of the big players have been told. I wanted to tell the stories of the little people and literally the kids, the children. So it's a hard story to tell. It's a hard sell. I was worried that people didn't want to hear this. Appalachia, where I live, is not very visible. It's mostly considered a joke. It's not respected.
The middle of nowhere.
Yeah, the middle of nowhere, which is our everywhere and everything. We don't see ourselves, on television or in the media that are all made in cities. I wanted to tell our story in a way that would really bring people inside and give them some compassion for what it's like to be born into this kind of sort of structural poverty and a place where all the safety networks are just full of holes.
Demon Copperhead takes its structure, if you like, from David Copperfield.
Right.
And you have a lovely story about how that happened.
Well, as I said, I was thinking about this story I wanted to tell and how hard it would be to tell it. And I kept thinking, nobody wants to read this. Nobody wants to hear this story. Really, for a couple of years, I was just completely up against a wall. I couldn't find the way in. And
what? It was too grim, or?
Well, I do grim. I mean, if you look back at all my books, I mean, I've written about, child abuse and environmental damage and, climate change, the hard things. But I think, honestly, it had to do with some internalized shame. There's a lot of victim shaming. We are just so accustomed to being laughed at. I think I just thought people wouldn't want to hear it. So I was in the UK at the end of my last book tour and had a weekend holiday before flying home. And I booked myself into a place called Bleak House, which is really Bleak House. It's where Charles Dickens lived when he wrote David Copperfield. It's out in Broadstairs. And it turned out to be very Dickensy. They just had a lot of original stuff in the house and nobody else was there, just my husband and me. And they said, just make yourself at home. And I was really drawn to this little room at the end of the hall, which was Dickens's study, where he wrote David Copperfield. Somehow I just felt called into that room and I sat with my hands on his desk, looking around at, the manuscript. It was very clear that he had written David Copperfield there and that was his book. That was his favorite, his personal story. And I started feeling this sort of anger coming up through the floor. And I realized he told that story. He told the story that I wanted to tell. I don't think the gentle Victorians wanted to hear it either, but he made them listen, by just giving them an amazing story he had sort of all the tricks, sort of a serialized, it was honestly, in its time, it was like serial TV. It was released in installments. People were waiting by the docks when the ships came in to deliver the next installment. I just saw that whole thing. And I felt like he was saying, go for it, do it, you have to do it. But here's what he told me. You let the child tell the story. That's the part I hadn't thought of. And right then and there on that desk, I started writing Demon Copperhead by own David Copperfield.
Now, it's written in the first person.
It is,
as the boy's story.
Yeah. That was the key to everything, because I couldn't see how I could tell people this story, but I understood that if the child himself, if the orphan himself tells the story, he's already got you on his side. There's some universality about a child saying, please listen. It's a survivor story. It's a hero's journey. It's all those things. That's what Dickens gave me. The key, the doorway in.
Now, there's sort of a fashionable argument at the moment around who can write what from what point of view. Mm-hmm. So you're writing from the point of view of a boy born to a drug addict.
Yeah.
In a place overtaken by the opioid crisis and all its horrible consequences. Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you really know about that?
Well, I was wondering if a 16-year-old boy would say, you don't have the right to tell my story, but that hasn't happened because I don't think those boys are reading books. But maybe they are. Maybe they are. No, honestly, I feel absolutely entitled to write this story, to tell this story, because this is where I live. If you came to visit me, we could walk down the road from my house and I could point to you the houses where the grandmothers are raising the grandkids. I know one of my family members is a therapist who works with the demon Copperheads, who works in the mental health and foster care networks. So I had a lot of people I could talk with about that. And I mean, everything that happens in this book has happened to somebody I know. Every family I know has lost somebody to overdose. So I know this story from the inside out, and the parts of it that I don't fortunately know firsthand, like, here's an oxy, how do you get it into your veins, the specifics. And honestly, sort of the whole slog, the terrible hardship of living as an addicted person, the inside of that disease, I'm glad to say I don't know from personal experience, but it was not very difficult for me to find people who would sit down and just tell me everything, and who were so honestly grateful to talk about it to someone who would listen and who could bring this experience to a wider audience of people who, I don't know how it is here, but in the U.S., we've had this 50-year so-called war on drugs, which has just been a brainwashing project to blame the victims and to sort of characterize the disease of addiction as a failure of virtue, a failure of willpower or something, which is, we don't talk about cancer that way. We don't treat other diseases like that. So that's what I wanted to sort of to be able to bring to a reader.
And it took prescription medication, I suppose, to start changing the way we think about these things. Because these were medications given by doctors to people for ordinary ailments, and they became hooked. And then they're buying street heroin and everything, and then their lives are ruined.
That is so much more true than people know. That of the people, the informants who became friends, the people I talked with about their addiction journey, every single one of them started with a prescription from a doctor,
and whatever it might be.
Yeah, and the instruction to set your clock, because this is what the pharmacy peddlers, the drug company peddlers told these doctors, is this how it's taken? This you have to stay ahead of the pain, all these things. And by the time they finished that first bottle of 30 pills, their brains had already been changed chemically so that if they don't get the next pill, they're so sick that, you just would rather die than remain dope sick. So I don't think, even though it is a crisis beginning with prescription drugs, I think there's still not enough. I've still heard people say, well, I had surgery, I took some of those pills, I didn't get hooked. It's a different situation for everyone, first of all. And second of all, there are a lot of people who just won't go against their doctor's orders because they don't have that kind of agency or what. It's just, this is a really vulnerable population. And also these are people who may not have the time or the means to go back to a doctor. They only get one chance. So the doctor, and we don't have facilities in our region where, alternative pain clinics and that kind of thing. We have, where I live, you might have to travel to a different state just to see heart specialist.
But this is something that, the first stories about OxyContin were being done 30 years ago. And it's still happening with fentanyl now.
Yeah.
I made a documentary about fentanyl in St. Louis.
It's terrifying. It's terrifying.
Why has America failed to grip this?
I think there's I think really a lot of it is that war on drugs, that government program that started out as, I think really it was a war on hippies, and then it became a war on Black people. It's just been this brainwashing project. They send people into schools. saying, just say no, characterizing drug abuse as a crime and treating it as a crime, as if incarceration will cure this disease. I think that it's a brainwashing project. It's really worked. And so now that this epidemic has reached so broadly into a lot of rural areas, also that's another problem. It's in rural areas, and the rural healthcare system is just terrible. There just are not enough. There are not enough physicians. It's like the county where I live in for many, many years, there was not one physician who could deliver a baby in my county. Everything is in cities, and so sort of everything is stretched thin in rural places, and the money doesn't go to rural places. So the kinds of treatment and the kinds of just actually interest and compassion isn't there. That's why I wanted to write this book.
Why do you think rural America, the America you live in and write about now, isn't part of the political conversation in America? Because what we've seen in the last, since Trump came along, was a big conversation about urban cities, the Rust Belt, trying to make all of that work. It hasn't, but at least it's now the conversation. That hasn't happened really for rural America.
No. The wealth is concentrated in cities, and the production of information is confined to cities. All of our news is made in cities. All of our entertainment is made in cities. Nearly half of the people in my country don't live in cities. So it's almost 50% of the people, but we are about 2% of what we see on television or in the movies. I can't even tell you the last film I saw about farmers or rural people that was real, as opposed to, something goofy and ridiculous and mocking. So that's one of the things I wanted to write about in this book is how rural people feel left out, feel mocked. We are well aware of the condescension. As Demon said, there are moments in this book where he turns and sort of speaks to the reader and he says, we can hear you. We hear you making jokes about us. Do you think we don't even have TV? There's so much anger. There's kind of this generation of anger against this condescension that people don't know what to do with. And so the first guy who comes along and says, I'm going to blow up the system, sort of gets a lot of traction because people haven't found any other way to be seen and heard. So, unfortunately, that polarization has made things worse because it's sort of validates this urban notion that we hillbillies are just dumb and will vote for, that guy. I'm not saying I didn't, but plenty of my neighbors did, and I understand it. So
that guy being Trump.
Yeah, that guy.
You don't like saying his name. Are you one of those?
Yeah. Yes, this polarization has made it breaks my heart what I see people saying on social media about rural people, just like writing us all off as like, see how dumb they are, how bigoted they are, that's what I'm up against as a writer. I feel like it's my duty. I did want to write about the opioid epidemic in this novel, but I also wanted to write the great Appalachian novel. That was my ambition, to explain that we aren't just one kind of people. We are a diverse people. We are people made of community. We are all kinds of people in Appalachia, the particular very rural region where I live, just to represent our lives with some nuance. And if you're talking about representation, that's my wheelhouse. I am Appalachian, and born and bred. I tried living everywhere else and came home because that's the place I love. It's beautiful. We have forests, we have pastures, we have, we grow food. our middle of nowhere is our everything, as I said. And I wanted to get that on the page. And it was a scary business to send this off to the city. I felt like, when I sent Demon to New York in the form of a manuscript, I was pretty nervous. So for my Demon to get the reception he's got, to find the readers he's found, like not just in the U.S., but here and all over the world, has been just amazingly rewarding. I'm so happy for all the real demons in my neighborhood.
Did people get the David Copperfield structure, or did you have to tell them?
I think they figured it out. It's actually I just laid my plot right over the top of Dickens. I wasn't sure it would work, but I thought I'll give it a go and see how far I can take this. And it just worked perfectly. And it was really kind of fun to write this with Dickens, sitting right at my elbow, because it was a masterclass in understanding how he fabricated those crackerjack plots, and those funny characters and this cadence of coincidences where, a character is really interesting and then disappears and then comes back up again. And I learned so much from Dickens writing this book that I had to thank him first in the acknowledgement. So
have you written differently to how you've written before?
In some ways, yeah. I think it's I would say I learned it's more like a screenplay in some way. I mean, it's a very long screenplay.
Which people say about Dickens.
Yeah, right. It is. It's very plotty, but the voice is my own. It's unquestionably, it's Appalachian language, and it's my voice. I mean, it's Demon's voice, is sort of the narrative engine, and he's a different character from David Copperfield. He's a lot more angry. He drops a lot more F-bombs.
Can we go back to you as Appalachian born and bred, and how you got to what you're doing?
Okay.
I mean, what was childhood?
I grew up in Kentucky, in a very rural place, a very little town. And I didn't even live in the town. Really small school, not a very good school. Almost nobody I knew was going to college, university, you would say here. People grew up to be farmers and farmers' wives, and my childhood was playing in the woods and in the fields. It was mostly conducted outdoors with no adult supervision. That's my idea of a perfect childhood. And it was, my windows on the world were books. I loved reading. I just ate the library whole, that every book I could reach. I was always reaching higher than I was allowed. As a kid, I wanted the adult books. I just read everything. My brother and I read the Encyclopedia Britannica together. He started at A and I started at Z, and we figured we'd meet in the middle and then we would know everything between us. We didn't get that far, but we know a lot. I know a lot of Z's. So somehow books were awfully important in a place where we didn't have access to, much other culture. Television did exist, but not as it does now.
But was it parents who made books important, or?
No, I don't think so. I mean, my dad was a reader. I saw him reading, and whatever it was he was getting from that newspaper or book, I wanted that too. So, yeah, but it's just something that caught me. I remember just disappearing into a novel at age 8 and thinking, wow, where did I go? I just was really aware of that. It was Little Women, as a matter of fact. I was aware of the fact that I had left myself and I'd gone into another world. And that seemed so important to me that I wanted more of it. Did I think I could do it? No.
It was never on the horizon? Or?
Never. No, I didn't know that people, I thought entities wrote books. I didn't think real, regular, ordinary people could write books. So no, I just wanted to go to university. I studied biology because that seemed practical. And I just kept writing in my notebooks, writing poetry, writing stories, and sort of keeping that a secret.
Because your first publications are science.
Yeah. Yeah, about the social life of termites. Pretty small audience
So even then,
for that.
you didn't think you were going to be a novelist?
No, even though I got, to go to university, and then I got to go to graduate school, and I did not imagine I could write for a living. I just wrote because I had to write. And then the writing sort of took over. That's the short version of the story. But it's still amazing to me that I get to do this, that I get to wake up in the morning and go to my desk and make stuff up for a living. It's just the best.
How do you think you end up deciding what you're going to write about, though? Because as you say, you pick big topics. Are they the things that are burning in you?
Exactly. That's exactly what they are. The things keeping me awake at night. I think it's a really audacious act to write a novel and then ask somebody else to put their own lives aside and read it. And I wouldn't bother you unless it seemed really important. So it's the things that are important to me that I think are probably important to everybody. That are scary, that are worrisome, that we could maybe think through a little, sort of maybe the things we want to look away from but deserve our attention.
And once you've written about these topics,
yeah,
do you feel any better about them? Or perhaps worse?
Yeah, perhaps worse. There is a kind of satisfaction, I think, because I don't just start with a topic. I start with a big question. And so the process of writing the novel is kind of not writing my way to the answer to that big question, because it's probably such a big question, there's not one answer. But I'm inviting the reader to sort of take a walk with me through this question. Story is one of the ways as humans that we process our world and sort of feel better about the things that worry us.
I mean, it's interesting you put it that way. I mean, there's some research out literally today taken from around the world, the Reuters Institute, which researches people's attitudes towards news every year. And this year, what they've identified is the extent to which people are switching away and avoiding the news, particularly on very difficult topics like war or economic hardship and cost of living and all those things. That's a big challenge to storytellers like us, because we're storytellers as well in a way.
Of course you are. And but because I'm this kind of storyteller, because I'm a novelist, I feel that I can offer an alternative. I do think, I'm trained as a biologist, and I think a lot about the human animal and what we evolved to do and what we didn't evolve to do. And we had these bodies and these brains for millions of years before, we recently acquired the capacity to learn about every bad thing that's happening to every person on the planet, just about. We can't process that. We just literally can't. It's too much. It can't feel real to us. We evolved to process personal information, interpersonal joys and sorrows. And, I think it's pretty important to remember what's my tragedy versus what's somebody else's tragedy. It doesn't mean that I can't care about all those other tragedies, but I can't bake them casseroles. I can't go to their house and help them feel better. So that's just there are kind of natural boundaries about what we could, how much tragedy we can process. The novel, brings you a story in a personal way. So it's almost as if Demon Copperhead is your friend. He's the little boy who is talking to you. So it's another way of providing. I think a novel can get information into a human heart in a way that the newspaper or the journalists can't quite. And we need them. We need you. we need it all. But I think we can be forgiven sometimes for turning away from the news, because it's like more... It's like expecting all of us to run marathons or, or like do some athletic feat that we can't do if we just aren't made for it.
I mean, I wouldn't need to be a psychiatrist to have detected the sort of the deep discomfort when you talk about Trump, for example. Is that something that you feel you have, you struggle to think about right now, given that he's back and he might well be back in a big way?
Yeah, well, I mean,
because you've written about that sort of post-Trump politics as well.
Yeah, well, because I live in the middle of what people call Trump country, I almost feel like an ambassador. I feel obligated to sort of cross the barriers between the, sort of this antipathy gulf between rural and urban and explain this is what people are feeling, and they're not really voting for, this narcissistic, fill in the blanks. They're voting for the possibility of something different, and he's what they've got. And so if we can explain this to each other and ourselves, maybe we'll get to something else.
So shouldn't your burning anger in that instance be towards the Democrats and everything else?
Well, it's
for the failure.
The failure of compassion for rural people and the predicament that we're in the 21st century. Yeah, I'm pretty mad about that. But anger doesn't get you anywhere. Better to write a novel. And I'll tell you that I have heard from a lot of urban readers of this book who said, wow, I didn't realize it's classism. It's classism. I didn't realize that I was that kind of a bigot. So that's what I can do.
What do you think? Where is the bigotry?
Just assuming that,
given there's urban poverty as well in America.
There is, and somehow that is in all the movies, and it's almost fetishized. It's sort of like it's a whole genre. And young men sort of want the clothes and the grills, and it's in a weird way made attractive by the media in a scary way. But rural people, they're just, the assumption is that we're just in, like the way Demon puts it, we're like junior varsity people. We would all be sophisticated and live in cities if only we were smart enough and ambitious enough. We're just dumb country people who don't have any better plans than just to, sit in a cow pasture. That's the bigotry. That's that presumption that we all want the city life. We don't. Who's going to grow the food, for starters? It's just a prejudice. It's an unexamined prejudice.
Is the great failure you expose in Demon Copperhead that really an awful lot hasn't changed since David Copperfield?
That's kind of the meta message there, and I was quite conscious of that when I, from the very beginning, I thought, wow, this would be a statement. And the opening quote from Dickens says, "It's in vain to recall the past unless it works some influence upon the present." I pulled that out of David Copperfield. In case you missed it, it's about structural poverty, and it's in his case it was urban. He was talking about street urchins. It wasn't this urban-rural antipathy. That's another whole element that I used his plot to kind of bring to bear. But I think the pervasive theme here is victim shaming, isn't it? Victim blaming. You're in the mess you're in because you didn't work hard enough, or you weren't smart enough. I'm here because I'm a better person than you are.
But there's so much economics in truth in the story of the opioid crisis, isn't there? It's really about structural poverty
exactly.
that put people in this
position. And quite deliberately.
So is America capable of ever solving the opioid crisis, given it's a capitalist state?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I have to hope so. And I do believe just the fact that journalists have exposed this story, and pretty much everybody I know now knows why the Sackler name is coming off the buildings. I mean, we have learned, and the next step is getting some of that settlement money back to the people who need it. That's not happened yet. So that's the next challenge. But I do see, that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I have to believe that.
So if you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
I would keep doing what I'm doing, which is try to build compassion, to try to break down the walls of othering, to create empathy for the theoretical stranger, because that's the opposite of meanness and bigotry and war.
Barbara Kingsolver, thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. Thanks for your interest.